I'm sharing the slides, and I am going to share. I think. Let's see.
Jeremy, do you want to record this with OBS?
I'm okay with it. I just don't know if the quality is worth recording, but yes, I'm okay with it.
No, because I had
Okay.
lots of struggle. I mean, I basically lost most of the recordings we had with Jitsi. They were not recorded
Okay.
anywhere.
Oh
So
no.
Got it.
yeah. Oh yeah. So I'm very, very annoyed with Jitsi, and in fact, I wanted to set it on fire. But Jeremy said before setting it on fire, let's try OBS first. So
Well, for what it's worth, I've successfully used OBS to record some Gosh meetings in Jitsi before, so at least we have
okay,
that experience.
that's a good present. I was able to open the presentation. Do you want to? If you cannot share it, Tarunima, I can try.
I'll do this now. I can't see any of you,
Yeah,
but that
but we
is
can
fine.
see
Just
your screen.
yes, call for my attention if I should look at the window. Okay. So, is it full screen mode? Can you all see?
Yep,
Like, okay.
and
Yes.
it moves and everything.
Yes. So I will start with a lot of disclaimers, which is that so it's some brief background to myself, which is that I taught science and math at primary school. I was working at a makerspace. I was working on an IoT project, and somewhere along the way, I landed up getting a degree in public policy. I won't get into how that happened, but that's also where a lot of the ideas that I'll be discussing today. That's when I got introduced to them. So intro, microeconomics, stuff like that. I wasn't sure how much this group knew, and maybe you all are familiar with these terms and familiar with them a lot more than I am. But when I so when I had done some of this work, I was a lot of my learnings were around open source software, and I now run a FOSS project on co-run. A lot of us are a part of it, but yeah, on basically. Building tools and data sets for misinformation response in India. And a lot of it is to do with machine learning and large scale models. And uh, I remember my reflections from Gosh in 2017, where because I was still at the time buzzing with a lot of these ideas from like microecon policy, etc. I remember just thinking of the distinctions between hardware and software. So I think some of these thoughts have been in my mind for that long. I just never got to thinking through them, and this is the materials readings, all of those are still available. Thankfully, I will share the link. So this was something I'd done in 2016, and when I went back to looking at some of the readings, I realized I didn't remember most of. So I actually my thoughts are a lot more fuzzy than I would have wanted them to be for this presentation. But anyway, but the way I'm going to approach it is that I'll discuss my level of understanding and see your feedback, and just like think of this as a brainstorming exercise more than anything else. Um, and the other big influence for this presentation is this book by Steve Weber, which I have, I think, linked in some of the previous conversations. And it's called The Success of Open Source. What distinguishes this book for me from some of the other texts on open source movements is that it is a political economy perspective on the open source movement. And so, instead of um, sort of framing it as um, like as an ideological good, the Steve Weber is actually looking at the historical processes and what was happening at IBM and Multics, etc. It's a very interesting like link to the antitrust policy at AT&T, because of which AT&T at the time is really wary of filing any patents for the work that's happening there. And then that's partly how Multics comes out and goes into a university setting. So it's a very interesting, and I would say like a different lens to open source. Is this a book that everyone's familiar with?
I haven't read it, but I know of it.
Okay. Um, okay. Yeah. So if at any point some of this is redundant, please let me know, and I will skip over it. I think, yeah, like the general perspective with the book, one of the things he also says, he's like actually riffing on that the quote where uh, Loris Lessing has this quote about how information wants to be free, and so Steve Weber says that's really not true. Information doesn't want to be anything. It's more about what institutional practices, etc. We put information in and deploy information for. So yeah, and I think it really it's just like looking at open source as a historical process, and one of the things he also says in the book is that it matters where you start, and if you had changed the starting point, you could have ended up in a different place. um, and yeah, and I think it's like I don't have to agree with all the arguments and the framing of the book, but I think it is interesting to sort of think of open source as something that emerges in part because of certain institutional regulatory sort of scenarios, or at least the success and the way it evolves with eventual adoption by um, a lot of big companies. So a lot of that had to do with what the regulatory scenario was, and just how businesses were structured, and the transitions that they were going through during the 70s and the 60s. Okay, so with that background, um, this is so the book. Steve Weber's book is about open source software, but he's also talking of it as like a political economy text, and he says that the open source process has some generalizable characteristics, um, and the question becomes: Are these knowledge domains that are there other knowledge domains that are structured similarly to the software problem? And then he's just sort of saying that there are certain dependent variables and independent variables, but I think that's kind of the problem I want to um, sort of think through today, which is that with open hardware, we've seen people like we a lot of us, we haven't seen the ready adoption, and we're all here thinking through the pricing models, the revenue models, business models. How do you actually make open hardware sustainable? And what I wanted to use this presentation was to sort of think through the ways in which open hardware and software are and are not similar, and then to see that does that help us understand something more about where open hardware, like what additional challenges open hardware may have, which open software movements did not have, and that need sort of additional or different ways of thinking. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay. This is my really dumb attempt at drawing this curve. So one of the considerations with software, this is just like your demand supply cost like average cost kind of curves. And so one of the things that happens with software is that your cost of producing, so you have a fixed cost of building in building a system out, right? But then um, your like for the cost of reproducing software is significantly low, right? So it's no or low or nearly negligible, right? And what that generally means is that the more you produce, the more your like initial fixed cost in investing in that software is justified. And so with software, what you land up having are these like runaway economies of scale, which we've seen with social media, which we've seen with operating systems. So generally, that this is something that is observed with software. And I think that my understanding of some of the conversations with open hardware and what I read online is that a lot of like the cost of producing the ideas, right? So which is that, okay, like someone has produced a blueprint, and we share it with other people, and so the cost of sharing the blueprint itself is negligible. But having said that, it's the cost of actually producing that gadget, right? So let's say we were talking about the MRI scanner, that is not negligible. So that is something I'm going to, so again opening this up as a discussion is to just hear all of you think this through, which is like, do you actually think that the marginal cost of production for hardware and open hardware is negligible or tending to zero, or is
Do you,
fixed? Yeah, yeah.
do, should we leave the discussion for the end, or can
No, I
we
think let's
like?
just, yeah, I think let's just do it. It's only 3 slides, so I think
Okay,
I'd rather just
cool.
do like slide by slide and yeah, just do a
So
discussion. Yeah.
Ben has his
Yes.
hand raised. Ben,
Yes.
if you want to speak, just unmute yourself. I see them muted.
Cool. Learned something new today. If you keep pressing the spacebar, then you can unmute just for the time you're pressing it. Okay. Yes, I do believe that the marginal costs reduce over time because you have a variety of suppliers that you can get the hardware from. However, that is just a theory. I think that is a question of you would need to calculate this on the specific machine, right? So if there is a very special manufacturing process involved in the hardware, I don't think you would see the same effect. However, you would be able to repair it. So there are some effects that would make such a statistic. Maybe, yeah. I'm struggling here because I've had a good conversation with a member from the Open Source Business Alliance a month ago, and he said for software we don't want to follow this narrative because we don't want to be cheap. And he named a few arguments why this doesn't happen for software in practice. So I'm not sure if this assumption holds in practice. However, there are, of course, a few arguments that would support this thesis.
I think Anna has her hand raised, and I have a comment, and Daniel has another one.
Yeah, I don't think it tends to zero. I think it can reduce. As was just being said, that there can be economies of scale in your purchase of parts and so on. But it's never going to tend to zero because you have a physical cost of each unit. Even if you look at traditional manufacturing, just because you produced 100,000 units, it's not free to produce the next one. There's always going to be a cost. There is a material cost and a running the machines cost and everything. But so I think how much it follows this curve depends on the ratio of the development costs to the per unit production costs. So because your development costs will be spread over however many units you produce. So if you produce 10 units, or if you produce 1,000 units, if the time and effort and cost it took to develop it was the same, then your per unit cost is obviously much lower for the 1,000 units. So it depends on whether that cost is, how that compares to the production cost. So, I mean, and you see this in all types of manufacturing. So, for example, in pharmaceuticals, the development cost of a new drug is very high compared to the per unit cost of producing one tablet, because of all the years of trials and approvals and whatever. So although you can end up spreading that cost over hopefully thousands or millions of units, you need to, because it was a big cost to start with. I don't actually think that the economics of open hardware in that sense are particularly different to closed hardware, in that there is a in whatever way it's been funded, there is a cost of developing something, and that needs to be, if you're going to amortize that and recoup it from the sale price of the unit, then it will just have to be spread over how many units are going to be produced.
Tarunima, do you want to reply now, or do you want to hear all comments and then reply?
No, I mean, I think it's a discussion. I don't have great replies. So,
Okay.
yeah, we can just hear all the comments and see if other people have responses. Yeah.
So my comment was trying to understand economies of scale. Are we thinking open hardware would come to replace the business as usual now of closed hardware, or are we thinking of a model of distributed manufacturing where maybe that model doesn't apply? I don't know. I think this picture is more complex for hardware. I think there are other variables that we should consider. And even if open hardware has this promise or this claim that, well, you save a lot of innovation costs because someone else has opened it and they have absorbed those costs, and then you just have to manufacture it, which is what I hear a lot of people saying. I think there's still a lot of customization and adaptation, not only to the manufacturing process, but also to local reality and your users and your customers, that doesn't happen, at least from the cases that I am aware of. But yeah, I don't know. I also think, as Mo said, that maybe it's time to for software also review this one, but I will leave that. I think that's another discussion. Daniel, you had your hand up. I don't know if you want to say anything.
I don't know. Just I'm not sure if all open hardware products should be scaled to like maximum extent or something. I think often they also serve like a smaller need or something, and not something that every person should have at home or something. So this is one thought, and the other is like, I don't know, like just for if you're using something like injection molding or something, like technologies for mass production, maybe then you can get out many, but I'm not sure if it's useful to compare. I thought it was more, what I was thinking more about was like what Jeremy and Paul and so on were discussing, if there's a way to channel all these other efforts that you have to do in a big company or something, and use these resources in a more streamlined way. If someone already has whatever done product testing, certification things or something, if you do it for many products, it's probably easier than if everyone has to do it for the very first time and learn everything by themselves. But maybe this is leading into a different direction.
Oh, my comment was absolutely in line with that. I wonder if there is a. I don't see. I see that openness again is a term that is open to many interpretations, and some people want to go full economies of scale and like an openness as replacing the current paradigm, but open. And then there is another stream of people who are talking more about distributed manufacturing and small businesses. Pen/Mo/Moritz.
Okay, so it's me, Moritz. One comment opinion I would like to offer on the economy of scale and open hardware is that on the one hand, obviously, the long-term goal should be the same with open source software, replace all proprietary hardware with open hardware. But that's like so, let's say, far into the future that it's nice to have it in the mind, but realistically, the thing I'm actually most interested in with regards to what we call like open hardware and specific in the economy of scale is that we have so much hardware products that are created in our current economy that are basically one use and throw away, or very hard to repair because you do not longer have schematics. I mean, if you look at electronic components like oscilloscope and all this kind of stuff that was created in like the 70s, 80s, and even the beginning of the 90s, you often had like a manual that gave you all the schematics for the mechanical components and even often for the electronics for it, so you could repair stuff. None of that is generally the case today anymore. And for me, one of the most important things, especially when we look at climate change and how we can reuse stuff we have, on those kinds of stuff, is making stuff as open as possible at every step of the way, with quotation marks, would allow people to use products for longer periods of time and reduce our resource consumption. And that's when we look at economy of scale. For me, this is something I would be interested in. Like, how do we get companies, not necessarily to make like everything like 100% open source, but like make enough of it open source that people can repair the most common problems that they encounter with products by themselves or at a local shop, without all the resources that are required to get something to like a centralized repair facility outside the country and stuff like this.
Anne? Oh, sorry, I don't know if anyone at the Mo's house wants to say anything else.
Just thumbs up.
Yeah, thumbs up.
Okay. Anne?
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce an idea that I've heard and sometimes talked about myself, which is economies of scope as a contrast to economies of scale. So that the idea of, instead of saving money by doing lots and lots and lots of the same thing in one place, can we make it cheaper by doing it in lots of different places, or doing lots of different things in one place? So and I do think in both cases there are opportunities for cost savings. So if you're, I think that one thing that a challenge that a lot of open hardware products have is that the documentation is not really to a level that allows reproducibility, and doing that is quite a cost investment. Whether it's charged for or not, it's an effort investment. There is a cost in the system for it. And if you can spread that out by then giving it to lots of different organizations to make, then there's a cost saving there. But then we can also think about the other way of having one center for manufacturing that is making lots of different things, and you know, obviously a 3D printer is a great example of something very flexible that can be making a microscope 1 minute and a spare part for something the next minute. So I think that this introduces some different ways to think about how economies can be realized.
I agree with the economies of scope. Is I prefer it to economies of scale, but also that cost of openness, even if it's we lost the video. Tarunima, we lost your presentation.
Yeah, I think I have low bandwidth, so it's just automatically disabled. So someone else might have to share. Yeah.
Okay. What I was saying was that even if that cost is spread, or even if the team or who originally designs makes a lot of effort on providing very good documentation, still that cost exists. And right now, I think we're not considering it at all. And I think that would be an interesting thing to just going back to Jeremy's blog post on revenue sharing. I think that's a cost that should be included somewhere, and it's a cost of openness that we're not looking at all. With software, you don't have that because you just, I mean, it's much less, in my opinion. I will try to share your presentation, Tarunima.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing again, all of these are intended as provocations. I think the point I was going for was that economies of scale is what makes open source software production, or just generally the fact that your marginal cost is negligible makes it um, easier for open source software to be economical. But also with hardware, I with open hardware, I my assumption is that um, the purpose of the openness is adaptability. I understand that's not necessarily the case, right? But just if something is built, yeah. Sorry, Anna. Yeah, you please.
No, I just wanted to say that for me, in my mind, that it's almost the opposite. Like that's something that makes it easier for open hardware, because nobody expects to be given an item, a physical item, for free. So it's easier to create a sustainable business out of open hardware. Just because the design is open, people don't know that actually getting the materials and putting them together in the right way, people know that's not free. Whereas with software, there is this perception that, you know, you've just copied a file. You know,
Yeah,
why can't I have it for free?
yeah, yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, True. Okay, yeah, we can move on to the next one, which is network effects, which is also linked to I think a lot of the discussion we've been having already, which is that that the more people who use a specific good or service, the more its value increases. So we've seen this with in the software world, it's evident with e-commerce, social media, ride sharing, operating systems. Um, and with open hardware, I think, or just generally with hardware, I think network effects would help, right? Which is that the more people use a certain hardware, or the more they tinker with it, the more documentation there is, the um, yeah, like the more value there is, and easier it is for people to adapt it to their contexts. And so on the whole, like network effects should help any open hardware project. um, yeah, but having said that, uh, I think that the provocation was that, is this even something that um, we should aspire to? Because to an extent, what a lot of interoperability protocols are trying to get to is to restrict um, network effects in the hands of a handful of people. um, so so yeah, like I guess like network effects can manifest themselves in a lot of different ways. And so the question is, yeah, like what is perhaps coming in the way of these network effects kicking in for hardware? That's one side, and I think there's a provocation on the next slide for that. But also that, yes, when like what forms of network effects are the ones that we should and should not aspire to. Yeah. Sorry, Anna, you again. Yes, please.
I think that's a super interesting question. It's not one I'd really thought about before, but two things spring to mind straight away. One is that there are definitely network effects that we should aspire to in the creation of the infrastructure for distributed open manufacturing. So making it easy to share and find the right file and the documentation, and to find the machines that have the capability to make that thing and all that kind of stuff. The other thing that comes to mind is like the interoperability of parts. So when you think about kind of modular products or things that have been maybe it starts as a whole product, but that can be repaired very easily. So one of the classic examples often given, I think, is the AK-47, which is, and I'm definitely not saying that's something we should aspire to, but the fact that the parts are very interchangeable has enabled it to really spread far. It's easy for somebody to start local manufacture of a particular part that's needed as a spare part. And so I think that kind of network effects is something we should be aspiring to.
Just to comment there, I don't know if you could call it network effect, but something that we discussed on the last meeting. There's critical designs that are the ones that are enabling others to build on top, beyond being able to be repaired like more easily. But again, like a microscope, that you will use it in any kind of other designs that use microscopes as a principle, and like a microscope, many others. I think this kind of open platform, it's something that we should exploit somehow. Let me know when you want to change, or when you want me to move them. Yeah, it would be good to come up with a pen with an example that is not AK-47. As if anyone has an example, feel free to drop it in the chat. Harris? I think I saw his hand raised, but I don't know if he's there or not.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello.
Harris, you're on mute.
Okay.
There you are. Yeah,
okay.
now you're. Yeah.
Okay, so this might come as totally not having anything to do with what we're discussing, but about interoperability of parts and the AK-47 and things like that. One example, I would be for interoperability and spreading out the production of parts purely for political reasons. For example, one of the things that, like, if somebody has the sole, if like all the chips are produced in America or something, then there's it can be misused politically, and it's the same, for example, aviation industry in Iran, for example, they've got the highest rate of airline accidents because they cannot get spare parts for their airplanes, and they just drop out of the sky. So I don't know if this is if this is relevant or not. Apologies if it isn't. So my point, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, my point is, if okay, of course, politicization it can cut both ways, but I think we should be in the sense of North Korea producing an atom bomb as well. But on second thoughts, but I think on balance, it might be a good thing to have many people producing like the same things being produced in many places, spread out in the world. If the yeah.
The geopolitics of it is very interesting. I always think that open hardware would never make it into the defense industry for geopolitical reasons, but I'm open to discuss that any other time. So people are naming trucks. In Argentina, it's the F-100, which is like is discontinued by Ford, but people still like use it and repair it forever. Tarunima, do you want me to move on with the
this is the last one, which is transaction costs, and this is a concept that I use a lot more liberally than economists do. But the idea is that there is a cost to any transaction in the market, and um, you know, I think the economic theory gets very detailed into like what kind of transaction costs there are, but a transaction cost could be um, the cost of like figuring out what people want, right? So when you do market research, that's a transaction cost. When you when you bargain, that's a transaction cost. So like the time you spend in a flea market, like exchanging information and bargaining, that's a transaction cost. And like on a very liberal like interpretation, everything is a transaction cost. But I think that what is interesting about this concept of transaction cost that I was like hoping to discuss is that it's not accrued to any one individual, right? But the ramification of a transaction cost is that when transaction costs become high is when you actually need institutions or companies to participate as opposed to individuals. So the higher the transaction costs, the sort of more hierarchical in some ways the enterprises and the organizations in that market become. So yeah, like is um I'm to me it's very so my baseline assumption is the transaction costs both for hardware production as well as for machine learning development are a lot higher than what it used to be for um, yeah, I mean not to say machine learning is still software, but I do think there's a distinction from what open soft force looked like in the last decade. So that's, yeah, I guess another question is that what do you think that, yeah, what do you think of the transaction costs with hardware and software?
Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question for clarification to start with. I'm not clear what you mean by not accrued to any one individual.
So let's say when you're bargaining in a market, right? Both the buyer and the seller are a part of that bargain, right? But it's not a cost that is going to any one individual, right? Like it's not a cost that I can say is a part of my production, or of like making that object.
No, but you can say that both the buyer in that example, both the buyer and the seller have accrued some transaction costs because they've had to spend the time bargaining.
Right.
Or if in a
Right.
different example, if somebody has to walk half a day to reach the market to get the
Yes.
product, then
Yes.
they as an individual have incurred transaction costs.
Yes. Yes, that I agree with. Yes, yes. So I guess okay. I see why that line can be confusing, but the jump I was trying to make was that, say, you're talking about, like, you're in a market buying vegetables, and then two individuals can undertake that transaction cost, like as in it gets absorbed as individuals can participate in it. But say that you're discussing the sale of like aeroplanes, um, where there are a lot more um, like raw materials, a lot more players involved in the production of, and a lot more moving factors. That's where it becomes harder for individuals to participate, and that's where it becomes more important for like a company to absorb both like the internal transaction, like the internal cost of managing the engineering effort, right, and then like bargaining on behalf of the entire team that has produced that aircraft. So yeah, I guess if that line is distracting, we should ignore it. Yeah, yeah.
Just wanted to I had a hand raised, sorry, but it went away. And I stopped the sharing because it was the last
Yes,
slide.
yes, yes.
So I think that it's good to, I don't, or for me, in my head, I need to make a distinction between someone reproducing open source software at home, downloading, and a company starting a product, and how, because the marginal costs from the very first slide and the transactional costs for the individual is almost, it tends to zero and it's almost nothing. But when you're talking, it's like what Mo said, like when you're talking about making a product, you don't want to go cheap, and also you start having those transactional costs anyway. And in open hardware, there are lots of transactional costs like that. And when you want to reproduce an open hardware design, you also get them. I don't see how that can be transferred, or I cannot think of any example when you want to reproduce an open hardware design, you have a lot of, because of lack of good documentation, but also because maybe the components are not accessible locally, you have a lot of that transaction around. I would say I'm equating in my head transactional costs very liberally again, to friction, let's say.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's how I was using it as well. Yeah.
So I think, right, even I don't think if in the future, if we can aspire to a zero friction hardware, open hardware, I don't know how that would look like because of so much local aspects that are related to it. I I know that Harris had a hand. I know Jeremy had a hand too, and Anna. So Harris, Jeremy, Anna.
Okay, I can be really quick. I was thinking about passing, but just introducing the spanner in the words that maybe we've got a problem here in the sense that we're talking about. The question I want to put is open hardware different enough, and what we aspire for our open hardware and the marketing of, or the economics of it to be? Is it going to be very different to the current economic model of closed software ownership, like economic terms, or not? Because I think there was some friction in times when we were thinking like we would like it to be like that, and then there was a friction with, these are terms that they would be there anyway. I don't know if that makes sense. I'll stop there, and you don't have to answer because we only have 3 minutes. So, oops, sorry.
Okay, Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy. Anna?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the what Harris said about what's different to the status quo, and one area that it seems to me that open hardware can offer a benefit in terms of transaction costs is around interoperability questions, because if you're trying to change from one proprietary format to another, that is a transaction cost. Like if I've got my data in an accounting software package and I want to buy a different one, then the effort to transform my data into the new format is a transaction cost. That's part of the friction of that transaction. So if at a system level, if open hardware is offering much more interoperability between different modules of something, and I can't think of a good example at the moment, but conceptually I can see that it could reduce the transaction costs for the whole system.
Thank you. Before moving on to you, Tarunima, for a closing, I think something that I have listened along all this hour of discussion is that we focus a lot on the how in the open hardware movement, but I'm not sure the horizon and the why is very clear. There are different visions for open hardware, and some people envision it, as Jeremy said, community empowerment, and I particularly share more that vision. And other people envision it more as scaling with open hardware. And I think it'll be interesting to understand if those are compatible or not, or the points where they touch and the points where they conflict. And that is exactly what the guy at the panel did with the Things Network. So that paper, I'm going to share it as soon as we have it. But I did some of this work about Gosh and it's published, but I think it will be, even for this group, to try to understand which are the different futures that we have in our head, because if not, it will be really confusing. Tarunima, do you want to give a general closure?
Yeah, no, well, thank you for indulging the very half-baked thoughts and questions. Yeah, I think I also noticed the two very clear distinctions between produce at scale but open hardware, and then local adaptation, context, right? And I actually think those are very different, different sort of problems to solve. And it's possible like the two can sometimes conflict. I was thinking a lot more in terms of the latter, and also that a lot of the questions were also were not just about reproducing and distributing, but it was actually about adapting and building and then sort of sharing. So yeah, those are just where I was coming from.
Thank you. I see a lot of
Yeah.
gestures at Mo's apartment. I don't know what's going on there, but
Yeah, very
I'm
exciting.
sure they're having fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, does anyone want to say anything else before we close and we see each other in January, and probably not the second week because it will be very early during the year, probably the third week, if you don't mind.
No.
Yeah, can
Any-
we set a date for just this January?